on the broadcast. I want to welcome everyone to the second webinar on Community College Baccalaureate's workforce. And the presenter this morning, as with the first webinar, will be Charles Goldman. Charles is a RAND senior economist specializing in economic of education, strategic planning for educational systems and organizations, and performance of schools and universities. Charles holds an appointment as professor of economics at the Pardee Rand Graduate School, where he teaches policy analysis of education. Prior to joining Rand in 1993, he earned his bachelor's degree in computer science and engineering from MIT and a PhD in economic analysis and policy at Stanford University, where he held a postdoctoral fellowship in the Stanford School of Education. I'll turn the rest of the presentation over to Charles, and just want to remind you, if you have questions, those that are online, if you have questions, you can send those to my email address that'll be shown on the slide in just a few minutes. And those in the audience, at the conclusion of Charles's presentation, if you have questions, we ask that you come up to the desk in front so that we can get your question recorded and use the microphone, please. And if you're using the microphone, be sure you touch the mic button and a red light should come on. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I'm very pleased to be here with you today in person and online to share with you the draft findings from our study assessing the potential for expanding community college baccalaureates in Texas. As Gary mentioned, please send questions by email to him. You can see his email address here on the slide. I'll show it again at the end of the presentation to remind you. But feel free to send questions along the way to Gary, and then when I finish the presentation, Gary will share the questions. As I told you in the first webinar, we're conducting two studies for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. The first one on community college baccalaureates, and the second one, a more general study on workforce modeling using empirical data to help the state of Texas improve decision-making about higher education degree provision. Today we're going to focus on the community college baccalaureate study. The objectives of the study are to develop a process to analyze statewide and regional workforce needs for bachelor's degrees in nursing and applied sciences, and to determine appropriate providers in the fields that have need, and if community colleges are deemed as appropriate providers, to inform which particular community colleges should ultimately be authorized. The agenda for today's briefing, I'm going to give you a quick background about the issue. I'll talk to you about the methodology that we've used in the study. Then I'll share draft findings on identifying unmet workforce needs in 5 specific fields. I'll then talk about the potential benefits that we've read and heard about for expanding community college baccalaureate programs. And then I'll talk about the challenges associated with that expansion. I'll summarize some of the options that are being used now for provision in the state of Texas and some information about costs. And then I'll transition into discussion of the policy options that the state of Texas has, some associated support activities, and finally I'll conclude today's briefing and then take your questions and discussion. So to begin, there are 3 general approaches to addressing unmet needs for baccalaureates. First would be expand the capacity of state universities, either add capacity to existing programs or start new programs at state universities. Second is to create partnerships between universities and community colleges. And the third is to develop baccalaureate programs at community colleges. The The legislature wants us to look particularly at this third option of developing baccalaureate programs at community colleges. By way of background, there are currently 17 states that allow community colleges to offer baccalaureate programs, and you can see them shaded in blue on the map. Texas, in fact, 10 years ago, authorized 3 community colleges to begin offering baccalaureate programs. You can see most of the other states that have authorized this only have a handful of colleges. The states that have moved the furthest are Florida and Washington, and in the study, we looked into what they did in Florida and Washington and how things have played out there to help inform policy decisions in Texas. The existing community college baccalaureate programs mainly fall into 4 broad fields. Science, technology, and business are the most common. A number of states also have programs in education, and some states have programs in nursing. Let me talk about the methodology. We're using multiple methods in this study. We're looking at quantitative analysis of workforce needs. We're looking at interviews with employers, professional leaders, accreditors, and post-secondary institutions, and a review of literature, experiences in other states, and existing policies in other states. We're using these 3 methods to develop a process that the coordinating board can use to determine whether baccalaureate degrees are appropriate and needed, to assess the unmet workforce needs, to determine whether community colleges are an appropriate provider, and then ultimately, if community colleges are seen as appropriate, to review specific institutions and proposals for approval. In order to understand the variation across this great state, we looked at 4 specific regions of the state. We made field visits to the 4 regions shown here. The Houston and Gulf Coast region, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, the West Central region, and the Lower Rio Grande Valley and Cameron County in the far south of the state. And we selected these so that we would get 2 of the large metro areas and 2 less urban areas that we could understand regional variation. There's, of course, more variation than we were able to sample in the state, but we think that these 4 regions at least give us a perspective on regional variation. In the course of the study, we interviewed over 300 stakeholders, and you can see on the chart here that we talked to 2-year colleges, to public universities, to private universities, to employers. We talked to some other experts in the various labor markets, for instance, from the Texas Board of Nursing. We talked to the regional accreditation agency that governs accreditation for Texas. And we also talked to Washington and Florida representatives of both the community college and the state university sector, as well as state policymakers. Those of you who attended or watched the first webinar may also recall that we sent out a brief survey after the first webinar, and we did a few follow-ups. Of that, we received 10 written responses to that survey, and we included those in our analysis. We are suggesting a 4-stage decision-making process to think about how to make this decision. The first stage is a baccalaureate degree needed in this field? Second stage is there a sufficient supply of those baccalaureates? Third is, what's the best approach? And the fourth is, if community colleges are seen as a good approach, which community colleges should be authorized? So whether a baccalaureate is needed should be viewed in context of what other degrees may be available. It could be certificates, could be associate's degrees, it could be a variety of bachelor's degrees, ranging from traditional academic bachelor's degrees to more applied ones. We then want to look at whether there is a sufficient supply and what's the best approach. I mentioned earlier the 3 possible approaches. So should the state focus on state universities, on partnerships between universities and community colleges, or on developing baccalaureate programs at community colleges? And then finally, which community colleges, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In today's briefing, we're going to show evidence that will help support this decision-making process. So I'm going to show you evidence that we analyzed on 5 specific fields to understand whether baccalaureates are needed and whether there's a sufficient supply. And then I'm going to show you a variety of findings on benefits and concerns about this policy, costs, some guiding principles, and some findings on process, which will help inform how to determine the best approach and ultimately which community colleges. Let me move now to identifying unmet workforce needs. The legislation that called for this study specified 2 areas of study: nursing and applied sciences. Now, applied sciences is a broad range, so we selected 4 specific applied science fields to study in depth in this study and to serve as a model for how the coordinating board can study fields in the future. We specifically studied computer and information technology, technical supervisors, fire sciences, and health information technology. For each of these 5 fields, we look at unmet workforce need by examining 3 factors. First, we look at whether the marketplace demands a baccalaureate degree. And in order to make that determination, we look at the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required by positions in a particular occupation, and in particular, whether those knowledge, skills, and abilities are such that a 60-semester credit hour associate's program would be insufficient to develop them. So is there justification for going beyond 60 semester credit hours? We also look at the entry-level requirements that employers post in their job posting, that licensing bodies may have, or other kinds of professional bodies. Once we have that, we look at the level of demand. We use the Texas Workforce Commission's projected job openings over the next 10 years, and we try to estimate the percentage of those job openings that might require a baccalaureate degree. Finally, we look at the current sources of supply. We look at existing community college and university programs, and in some cases, we may also take into account private institutions or even out-of-state programs. It's important to note that in Texas, unlike quite a number of other states, state public universities in some cases have quite significant experience offering applied baccalaureates. For instance, I mentioned we looked quite a bit at Washington and Florida. In Washington state, their universities really don't have a tradition or a history of offering applied baccalaureates. But in some Texas institutions do. One option is to have a field-specific applied baccalaureate. So this follows a very defined course of study. And in Texas, you have some universities that offer this, and the 3 initially authorized community colleges all offer this. There are 3 different degree titles that are used in Texas to cover these degrees. There's the BAS, Bachelor of Applied Sciences, Bachelor of Applied Technology, BAT, and the Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences, the BAAS. Some universities also offer a different kind of BAAS, which is a multidisciplinary Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences. And in the multidisciplinary BAAS, the university allows students to build a general bachelor's degree on top of an Associate of Applied Science, typically earned at a community college. The multidisciplinary BAAS degrees often don't require very much specifically in terms of a course of study, but rather they give the student the option to take courses from anywhere in the university in order to meet all the general requirements for a bachelor's degree in the state of Texas. So that means having sufficient general education, having sufficient upper division, but it's really up to the student to select courses that meet that student's educational objectives. Let me talk now about the 5 fields we studied, nursing and 4 of the applied science fields. As you may know, nursing is a field that faces very strong demand in Texas and elsewhere, particularly in urban areas. But what we found is there's also a rapidly expanding supply of options for students in Texas. We looked at the percentage of Texas nurses, registered nurses, that hold a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, or BSN. You may know the Institute of Medicine has called for an 80% target, that by 2020, 80% of registered nurses should hold a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. Furthermore, we found that many hospitals in Houston and in the DFW area are seeking magnet status. And in order to be accredited as a magnet hospital, the hospital must have 80% of its nurses holding BSN or have a credible plan to increase the level of education of the registered nurses to 80% BSN. And what you can see on the chart here are the regions of Texas. We're using the TWC's workforce development areas in the state to show the data. The dark green are the regions with the highest percentage of Bachelor of Science in Nursing. The highest areas in the state have roughly 60% of nurses having a BSN. In fact, if you average across the 4 largest metro areas, it's about 55%. Whereas if you look at the rest of the state, it's much lower. You can see rates down even below 35%. And the average in the rest of the state is right around 35%. So there's a big disparity between the metro areas and the other areas of the state. The TWC is projecting roughly 10,000 new registered nurse openings per year for the next decade. And so in order to maintain the current level of education, at least half of those have to be filled by BSNs. And in order to increase the level of education of nurses, there has to be steady production of nurses who are already practicing earning their BSN. So we looked at some of the graduation and enrollment figures. There are 2 basic types of BSN programs in Texas. There's what are called generic BSN programs. That is, student enters as a freshman, and he or she progresses through, earns a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, takes a nursing exam. And what you can see is over the past 6 or 7 years, there's been a noticeable increase in the graduates from BSN programs in the state, but a lot of this increase has come not from generic BSN programs, but from RN to BSN programs that take an already practicing nurse who's already licensed and give him or her the opportunity to earn additional credits and coursework to earn the BSN. If we look at enrollments, instead of just looking at graduates, you can see in the blue line very sharp increases in the enrollment in RN to BSN programs, particularly after 2010, when this influential Institute of Medicine report came out. Most of this growth is actually accounted for by one program in the state. UT Arlington has developed an online program for registered nurses who hold associate degrees and are licensed to earn their BSN. And their program has grown very rapidly over the past 5 years. It now accounts for 75% of all the RN to BSN enrollments and a third of all BSN enrollments in the state. So while there is very strong demand both for new nurses who have BSNs and for upgrading the credentials of existing practicing nurses, there's also quite a bit of supply and rapidly growing supply in the state. Let me move on more briefly to the 4 applied science fields. Computer and information technology is a field that we defined somewhat distinctly from traditional computer science occupations. So these are occupations that are not those that are traditionally filled by university computer science graduates, but rather are more applied computer occupations. But they're occupations that employers tell us require skills that go beyond what 60 credit hours can do. Employers tell us that they're increasingly adding requirements for bachelor's degrees to position notices. And when we look at occupations like this in the workforce data, we find that about 60% of job holders in these occupations already hold bachelor's degrees. The Texas Workforce Commission is projecting some 18,000 job openings a year in these related occupations. So very strong demand. In order to just maintain the current level of bachelor's degrees, the state would have to supply 11,000 new bachelor's degrees a year in these occupations. We also found that the openings are heavily concentrated in the 4 largest metro areas, in Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, the Austin area, and San Antonio. There are a number of programs that are applied programs in computer and information technology. There are 23 programs in the state of Texas that are applied as distinct from traditional computer science. But they graduated only about 600 graduates last year. So these, although there are 23 programs, they're not producing anything like what the labor demand seems to be. So employers are looking at other options. Many employers said that, well, although they like to have a bachelor's degree, there are other alternatives. They could take workers with associate's degrees and give them on-the-job training. There are what we call stackable credentials, where employees can earn different credentials for specific certifications, such as specific networking certifications or computer security, rather than having to earn a full-fledged bachelor's degrees. One of the things that was pointed out particularly by the higher education institutions, is that there's widespread knowledge that there's a gap in this area, but that a key limiting factor is not the existence of degree programs. It's the pipeline of students who are qualified and interested in entering these programs. And so while the state does need more production, it's not clear that opening the degree programs is necessarily the most important way to address this gap. We move on to the second applied science field. We call this field technical supervisors. It brings together a variety of occupations which are typically in production industries, in the chemical industry and oil and gas and so forth. Often workers start their careers with an associate's degree, but when it's time for them to move up into supervisory positions, their employers want them to have more management and leadership training, and that is something that could be acquired through a bachelor's degree. Employers are supporting existing programs in Texas that develop these degrees. This is a field that we estimate, using the TWC data, generates about 1,000 openings a year for new supervisors. Currently, only about 1/8 of those supervisors hold a bachelor's degree. So if we were to maintain the steady current level of education, we would need 125 new bachelor's graduates a year to equal that demand. But we know from our interviews that employers are interested in raising the education level of their supervisor population. It's important to note that the openings in this field are quite concentrated geographically. About half the openings in the entire state are in the Houston and Gulf Coast region. Employers are looking at other sources to fill these positions. Many employers are using engineers to fill these positions, but engineers really aren't trained for this kind of team leadership. There are 6 programs in the state that are currently specifically targeted to this workforce need, and they graduated about 150 graduates last year. The existing programs are really targeted to production and operations supervision. Another alternative would be, rather than have specific degree programs that target this workforce, would be to use the university's more general Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences, the BAAS degree that I mentioned earlier, which could allow students to start with a technical base and build on some upper division management and leadership classes. So that's another alternative. In general, we would see this field might support some new degree programs, particularly if they're very tightly connected to local industry needs and have the support of those employers. Fire sciences is a field that's undergoing also some upgrade in credential expectations. And it's actually very parallel to the technical supervisors that I just spoke about. But instead of being in the oil and gas and chemical industry, we're now talking about firefighting. And again, very similar needs. Firefighters will typically start their careers with a certificate or an associate's degree. But when they want to move up into middle management positions, their employers want them to have more management and leadership training. This is a fairly small occupation. The Texas Workforce Commission projects about 300 supervisory openings a year. Currently, about 40% of those supervisors hold bachelor's degrees. So if we maintain the same level, we would be looking for about 110 new baccalaureates a year. There are a couple of specific programs in applied emergency management in the state of Texas, but they're not really very specific to fire science. And we know that there's a movement in fire science to try to build industry-specific degrees. There's now a National Accreditation Council. They've published a model curriculum. So there's some interest, significant interest from employers in having some specific degrees. But it is a small program. It is a niche. And we also know that any program would have to be targeted to working firefighters, which means for practical purposes, really online delivery is probably the only practical way to address this need if the state desires to start fire science specific bachelor's degrees. And again, an alternative would be that firefighters could use some of these more general Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences or other kinds of general applied bachelor's degrees instead of an industry specific degree. The last field that we studied in depth was health information technology. This is an occupation that starts from medical records coders, the people who take your medical records and code them for insurance billing and for patient records. You probably know there's been a big change in this industry. The industry is computerizing medical records, and so there have been questions raised about whether this is going to generate more demand for bachelor's degrees. It turns out that if you talk to people in this field, you do find out that there are advanced educational needs in this field. But many of those advanced educational needs are actually at the graduate level. So they're not so much for first-line supervisors as they are for system designers, for people who can manage and maintain these large information systems. And what the employers we talked to, and the colleges and universities all told us was that really the best preparation for those graduate level positions are undergraduate degrees in traditional subjects, some in nursing, some in information systems, and then they can specialize at the master's level in a field that will bring them into health information technology. So we did not see a need for specific programs in this field. We also note that the state already does have 2 universities that offer field-specific bachelor's degrees that are directly related to health information technology. Now let me turn to what we read and heard about the potential benefits of expanding community college baccalaureate programs. Community colleges are seen as meeting local workforce needs. They're typically connected to the local workforce and to the community. They typically have a great deal of flexibility in working with local employers to develop or modify programs. I mentioned that we studied Florida and Washington in the study, and so one of the things we noted in Florida, Florida's had a very rapid expansion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in 10 years, Florida community colleges have developed 170 baccalaureate programs. So that really shows you the rapid speed at which community colleges can develop and implement programs. We also heard from employers as well as from community colleges that if we're trying to meet local workforce needs, that sending a student to university may get that student a wonderful education, but if you're in a more rural area, that may be exactly the motivation that that student needs to move to one of the big cities. And so the community college deals more with place-bound students, and employers often saw that as a benefit of having baccalaureate programs at community colleges. They thought they'd be more likely to hold on to those students in the local workforce. Another advantage that we heard about community colleges is that community colleges can attract students who might not otherwise seek or attain a bachelor's degree. Most community colleges are charging lower tuition than state universities. That's true at the 3 community colleges in Texas. It's also true in Florida. Community colleges typically schedule courses, especially these upper division courses, to fit the schedule of working adults. They usually have open enrollment, especially at the lower division. They don't necessarily have it at the upper division, but it does help to expand the pool. And by having a bachelor's degree at the same institution, you avoid the student having to undergo a transfer to a different institution and possibly becoming disconnected. We talked to a couple of students, admittedly just a couple, who graduated from one of the existing Texas Community College baccalaureate programs. And those students told us quite directly, we wouldn't have earned a bachelor's degree if it weren't for this program being here at our community college.
Charles, entire session is being recorded and will be available on the website in 3 or 4 days. And if any of you missed any part of this broadcast, you can view that in its entirety from our website. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and resume our broadcast, and Charles will pick up where he left off before our break. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. We were speaking about some of the advantages that community colleges offer, and another of those advantages is that community colleges, of course, have extensive experience in applied areas. They've got programs in applied fields, and they often have specific teaching facilities that support hands-on education. Many community colleges offer a small environment. They can have small class sizes. They may have quite close relationships between faculty and students. And again, some of the few students that we spoke to mentioned this as an advantage of attending the community college. Now let me talk about some of the challenges. One of the challenges that we heard quite a bit about is a concern about mission creep. Community colleges have a traditional mission to provide open access at the certificates and associates level, and the concern is that offering baccalaureates is going to shift attention and resources away from this traditional mission. If the baccalaureate programs have higher costs, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, that could end up increasing costs across the board and thus reduce accessibility to students in general, potentially even jeopardize open access. It's also a concern about duplication. Now, to some extent, Texas is a state with a quite competitive higher education system. And so competition can have positive benefits, but if it's unproductive or excessive, it can also have negatives. Universities, in some cases, may offer programs that could overlap, that could result in competition for students, competition for faculty, and other limited resources. We heard a lot about this in nursing. There's a real shortage of graduate degreed nurses to teach in nursing programs, and opening more programs could exacerbate that shortage. There's also potential competition over state funding and damage to existing partnerships between community colleges and universities. An interesting point is that institutions might end up competing over the same students even if the degree program offerings are different. A good example of this is a Bachelor of Applied Technology at a community college, which might be industry specific, but a local university that offers a Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences might be able to fill a similar need for a similar population of students, even though the degree program and its objectives are different. Community colleges also face challenges in resources, infrastructure, and clinical space. Community colleges that want to offer baccalaureate degrees are going to have to upgrade their accreditation with SACS from level 1 to level 2 to become a baccalaureate granting institution. SACS guidelines specify that colleges should have 25% of the major field courses taught by faculty with a terminal degree in the field. So that's going to require some community colleges to hire a significant number of PhD or other doctoral qualified faculty in these fields. Facilities obviously are important, although in a lot of the fields that we looked at, community colleges do have existing facilities that could be used. Clinical space is important in nursing. We heard a lot about competition for getting these spaces. We also heard that in the urban areas, in the DFW and Houston area, that hospitals are becoming more reluctant to allow associate degree nursing programs access to their clinical spaces because they're trying to achieve magnet status and because they want to support BSN programs. And finally, it's important that these programs are sustainable, and that requires funding and ultimately is connected to having a critical mass of students. So opening and developing a program that is going to target only a small student population may prove to be costly and unsustainable in the future. Community colleges also raise some concerns related to quality. I've talked about some challenges in resources and faculty. There's concern that employers might not perceive a baccalaureate from a community college as equivalent to a university degree. Although I should note that in many of the applied science fields, where we talked to employers really did not raise this concern. They raised concerns about the curriculum content and the preparation of students, but not so much about the institution. One of the points that many universities made to us is that universities offer an intellectual environment grounded in liberal arts and a research-based education, and they just didn't see community colleges as being able to offer that, and so that there would be an inevitable trade-off between a more specialized and applied education in the community college versus the more general conceptual education that universities can provide. Also, a variety of concerns have been raised about whether applied baccalaureate programs in general will prepare students for graduate education. Although we have heard that some programs have had success in transitioning their applied bachelor students into graduate education, and we know there's even a new movement to develop applied master's degrees in applied fields. One of the motivations for that is to help improve the pipeline of future community college faculty in those applied fields. Let me briefly summarize what we heard about current provision options and cost. I mentioned to you the three main options for meeting these baccalaureate needs. And what we found in the course of our interviews is that there are many examples of strong partnerships in Texas. These partnerships take somewhat different forms. There are articulation agreements For instance, there may be agreements that specify a clear articulation between a lower division community college program and an upper division applied baccalaureate. There can be guaranteed admission agreements, dual enrollment, and some universities have moved in the direction of being more willing to accept workforce education credits as lower division credits. There are also statewide initiatives to align curricula for the associate and baccalaureate level programs. Some universities are teaching on community college campuses, so although the students have to switch their matriculation from the college to the university, they can remain in place. There are also some regional centers where community colleges and universities teach in the same facility and again offer some of the same benefits. Costs are clearly important, but as it turns out, difficult to pin down. It's really unclear whether, in general, it's more costly to add capacity at universities or at community colleges. And that's partly because there can be important differences between startup costs and operating costs. Developing new programs or expanding existing ones requires an upfront investment. First of all, I've already told you that community colleges have to undergo effectively a reaccreditation in order to upgrade their accreditation status from level 1 to level 2. Colleges in Texas and Washington that we spoke with said that they thought that that process had cost the institution, roughly speaking, $250,000 to $500,000 per institution, often for new resources in the library, sometimes for other resources, as well as for the costs of undergoing the accreditation. And finally, they have to put together the courses that they're going to offer, and every course comes with startup costs, every program, because you've got to start up the program, you've got to incur costs before you get students in the door. And the same set of colleges told us that they thought, again, $250,000 to $500,000 per program was a reasonable estimate of what they thought they needed for startup costs. But they said if it's a program that requires highly specialized physical facilities or other highly specialized development, the costs could go up, potentially even up to $1 million to start a new program. Because of the community college's faculty work rules and the general lower salary scale at community colleges, operating costs are probably generally lower at community colleges, but universities might have a cost advantage if they already have a lot of capacity, both physical capacity as well as faculty capacity that they can use. Now, the funding arrangements that are used are going to have a very important effect on the division of the costs and therefore the viability of the program. In Texas, community colleges are funded mostly from local taxes and tuition. The state contributes only a minority of the costs to community colleges. The initial pilot community colleges in Texas did receive startup grants to defray their startup costs. So far, the community colleges that are authorized in Texas have been given state funding at the equivalent of the state university rate. So they receive the credit hour funding that the state universities receive. They have all set tuition at above the community college lower division level, but below the typical state university level. But the policies that the state sets going forward are going to have an effect. And so if the state, for instance, provides less funding to baccalaureate programs at community colleges than it currently is doing, that's likely to mean that the institutions will either have to seek more local tax revenue or raise costs on students, and that could affect access for students and whether the programs themselves are sustainable. Now, with all of those findings, let me briefly take you through the policy options that the state has. First, we found broad agreement across almost all the stakeholders on 5 key principles. First, everybody agreed that meeting workforce needs is of the utmost importance. that collaboration is important, and that partnerships and articulation should be used wherever possible to meet workforce needs. We asked the stakeholders about program approval process, and everybody agreed that the coordinating board's current program approval criteria would be appropriate for reviewing community college baccalaureates. They did not recommend changes to the criteria. But a number of the community colleges said that they really wanted to make sure that the coordinating board's process for approving community college baccalaureates would be clear, transparent, and fair, that they would know what the standards are, they would have an opportunity to present their evidence, and that they would be judged fairly and transparently. And finally, won't surprise you, many of the stakeholders said that they thought expanding baccalaureate provision in the state was very important, whether it was done at the community colleges or done at the universities, but that it needs to be supported by resources. So the state's got three broad policy options moving forward. First option is continue the status quo. That means there are three community colleges that are authorized. They are each under law authorized to propose up to 5 baccalaureate programs. And that what the state would do under this option is strongly encourage regional partnerships between community colleges and universities to meet unmet workforce needs. Second option is to place no specific limitations on community colleges offering baccalaureates. So allow community colleges to propose baccalaureate programs that they see as needed, to judge them by the coordinating board's process. I want to point out, this doesn't mean absolutely open season, because the community colleges that want to offer baccalaureate programs will have to meet SACS accreditation requirements, which imposes restrictions on their facilities, their administration, and their faculty. And they have to pass through the coordinating board's program approval process for each and every program that they propose. Finally, the third option would be to allow community colleges to offer baccalaureates, but to impose additional limitations beyond only SACS accreditation and the coordinating board approval process. And I'm going to talk briefly about what some of those options could be that the board could consider, board and legislature could consider. We've grouped those options into 4 categories. So the first is limiting the scope of provisions statewide, and I'm going to talk about that, and then I'll talk about the other 3. Now, the best policy options will be those that strike a balance between addressing the concerns that I mentioned without unduly affecting the benefits that I mentioned. And you can see on this slide a recap. The key concerns about expansion are mission creep, duplication, availability of resources, and quality. The key benefits that could be constrained are meeting workforce needs, access for students, the applied experience of community colleges, and the benefits of their small environment. These policy options are going to frame the 4-stage decision-making process that I introduced. So let me take you through a set of options that's related to limiting provision at a statewide level. So these would be general restrictions. So one set of restrictions is limiting community colleges to certain fields or degree types. So for instance, community colleges could be limited to only applied fields or applied fields and nursing. So nursing could be either included or not included. This would limit or could limit mission creep because it would keep the community colleges focused in particular areas. It could limit duplication because these, except for nursing, are areas where universities have less provision. On the other hand, whatever limits are put on can also reduce access and the ability to meet workforce needs. Another option that the state could pursue is limit the community colleges to a maximum number of programs each. So you don't want the community college to just turn into a state college and forget all about its lower division mission. So you could put some limit on the number of programs. Currently, there's a limit of 5 baccalaureate programs. Again, has the advantage of potentially helping to constrain mission creep, but it limits access and meeting workforce needs. Now let's talk about limiting provision regionally. So one option that the state might consider is allow community colleges to propose baccalaureate programs, but give universities the first right of refusal. In fact, some of the states require that the community colleges provide formal notice to the state university system of their intent to develop a baccalaureate program and allow the university system a period of time to respond. So something like this could encourage the universities to either develop programs to serve identified needs or might motivate them to form partnerships with community colleges. On the other hand, it will clearly add time to the process, and it might end up obstructing the process. And one of the things you certainly don't want is you don't want the universities to say, oh, yes, we'll do that, but then not actually implement a good program that meets the workforce needs. Another option that the state could pursue is when there's overlap between a community college program and a university program, especially direct overlap, require a higher standard of evidence that there's unmet need. So for instance, in nursing, we heard from the universities very strong concerns about having community colleges offer BSN programs. So if the state decides to go in that direction, it might be wise to say, when you propose a program that's already offered to universities, you really have to very clearly demonstrate that there's a need and a market of students that's not being served. Another set of options has to do with planning and monitoring. So another option is require community colleges to provide quality evidence that goes above what the coordinating board's criteria ordinarily require. So for instance, one of the options that came up is requiring community colleges to seek national field accreditation, for instance, in nursing or in other fields. That would clearly help to promote quality, but it turns out in nursing, these RN to BSN programs generally don't seek national accreditation because the standards for faculty resources are so high that make the programs extremely expensive to offer. So you really have to trade off the potential quality benefits with limiting the number of programs that could be developed, the cost of those programs, and therefore meeting the workforce needs. Another option would be to set a limit on the total number of colleges statewide that will be authorized and potentially to increase that limit over time. That's the strategy that Washington State followed. They initially said they were going to authorize 4 community colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees. They invited all the interested community colleges to submit proposals, and they convened a review panel that had college, university, and workforce stakeholders on it, and they selected the first 4, allowed them to develop their programs. They then repeated that process a few years later and selected an additional 4, so they expanded from 4 to 8. And then finally, about 3 years ago, they removed the limitation, and then they then allowed any community college to apply. And the stakeholders that we talked to in Washington viewed this gradual expansion policy favorably. Another option is to require community colleges to conduct an in-depth self-study for each proposal. The first program, baccalaureate program, is always going to require a self-study because that's part of the reaccreditation process. So the community college is going to do that. The question is, would the state like to require that the community college undergo that process of internal self-study for every community college baccalaureate program? In fact, we talked to one college in the state that has an internal policy that requires exactly this. They don't take any proposal forward to the coordinating board without a self-study. But it does require significant expenditure of time and resources. And so again, this is a policy that might promote quality, but it could also impose delay and restrict the provision of programs. Finally, we heard a lot of concerns about mission creep and quality, but it turns out there's little hard evidence about what really happens. Florida and Washington have recently begun doing some studies that are informative, but they're still not definitive. And so doing some follow-up studies on what happens to the certificate and associate's missions, what happens to tuition at community colleges, how quality of graduates is perceived could be very important. In the paper, in the report, we're going to talk about Florida recently commissioned a graduate salary study, and they compared, among other things, the salaries of community college baccalaureate grads with traditional university baccalaureate grads. They found the community college baccalaureate grads had higher average salaries and higher employment rates. But before you take that too literally, you should also bear in mind that the population that the community colleges targeted are typically already employed and already have years of work experience, and the study didn't control for those factors. Finally, the last collection of policies has to do with financial arrangements. Currently, the coordinating board is reimbursing community colleges at the same rate as state universities. The coordinating board and the state might want to consider lowering that reimbursement rate. So lowering the reimbursement rate might reduce the incentives for mission creep. It might reduce some of the competition for funding, but it's going to shift costs either to local taxpayers or to students, and therefore it could reduce the development of programs or make them harder to sustain, make them more difficult to access. And last policy that I want to talk about is changing the source of the upper division funding. So right now, all of the community college funding comes out of one pot, university funding comes out of another pot, and the funding for community college upper division credits is coming out of the community college pot. Taking some or all of that funding from the university stream or from a more general stream would have some effects, clearly. So right now, if under the current set of policies, if there was a significant expansion of baccalaureate programs in community colleges, that could have the effect of reducing the funding to all community colleges for their lower division, which might exacerbate some of the concerns about mission creep and service to the certificate and associates population. But of course, shifting the source of funding to one that directly competes with universities is going to increase competition for funding with the universities. Finally, we identified a number of useful supporting activities. We found a great deal of confusion over the different types and names of applied degrees. The Bachelor of Applied Science, Bachelor of Applied Technology, and the Bachelor of Applied Arts and Sciences, and they seem to be used in somewhat different ways. So institutions, students, and employers might all benefit from clearer and standardized definitions. If the state decides to authorize more community colleges to offer baccalaureates, it would be very beneficial to consider ways to connect the experiences of the 3 community colleges that have already been through this process with the new community colleges, and to incorporate their experiences as well as the experiences in other states like Florida and Washington, potentially into a guiding manual. And there might be a good opportunity for collaboration even with stakeholders in those other states. And finally, there's a need for more empirical analysis. I talked about some of this, but for instance, it would be possibly quite appropriate to conduct a cost study with greater experience to look at how much it costs community colleges to offer these upper division and potentially use that in setting future state reimbursement rates. Let me conclude by saying that at the national level, community college baccalaureates are increasing. The states are adopting them and considering them. The number are growing. Texas has some experience for the past 10 years. They offer benefits in preparing the workforce and expanding access, but they also raise concerns about quality and mission creep. And as we go forward, Texas has got a wide range of options that could maximize some of these benefits and limit the concerns, but every one of these options involves some kind of a trade-off. Improving the evidence base in the future will help understand and resolve those trade-offs better, but we don't have that evidence right now. And so your input can help the board as it wrestles with these policy decisions. You can get involved because next month we're intending to release a draft copy of our report. And we'd like you to read it and to send feedback on it so that we can incorporate your feedback into revisions in the report and the board can benefit from your feedback. If you've got questions, I'd be pleased to answer them, and you can email Gary Johnstone at the email address shown here. And finally, I'd just like to end by drawing your attention to some upcoming events. Tomorrow, the board committee with jurisdiction over this issue will be meeting here in this room, and I'll be giving them a slightly shortened version of this presentation and answering any questions they have. The full board will meet in this room on April 24th, and we're intending to propose that the draft report be released following the board meeting. I've provided my email address on the slide here, and again, Gary Johnstone's. You're welcome to email either of us. And as Gary said, in a few days, this webinar will be posted online if you or your colleagues would like to review it. And with that, I'd like to open up the floor for anybody who'd like to ask questions either here in the room or remotely via email.
Let's start with, Let's start with those that are in the room. Anyone want to come forward for ask a question or comments on the presentation? Okay. We have not received any questions online. I know with the technical difficulties we had in the first half hour of the program, of the broadcast, that some of the individuals did not get to connect and come back online to listen to this. So if you have questions, if you're viewing this online or viewing it recorded, you can send your emails to either Charles or me, and we'll try to get answers back to you by email. And we will create a question and answer page attached to this event page that you can find on our website, so that we can post the questions that we received and the answers to those questions. Anything else you need to?
I'm good.
Okay, we're good. Thank you very much for those that came and attended in person and those that were able to connect online. We appreciate your involvement and appreciate your comments once the draft report is issued in April. And after that time, once those comments are received, the revised draft will be presented to our committee in June at their regular meeting, and then the full board will approve the final report at the July meeting, the fourth Thursday in July. And the final report will be submitted to the legislative leadership by August 1st. So with that, we'll end this broadcast. Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Gary.